Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Perkins. This is our new novel called The Leaves in October. I'm going to read chapter 1 to you today, and then when you finish listening, you need to complete the questions and vocab for chapter 1. Chapter 1. When the leaves in October are red and gold, we'll be home, Livy whispered in the dark. She stared up at the ceiling from the fold-away bed she shared with her little brother, Younger, who was already asleep. He breathed heavily next to her with one twisted corner of an old tattered baby blanket tucked into his mouth. Younger never let go of his blanket these days, though he was almost 6. Livy closed her eyes tightly, but the tears rolled slowly down her cheeks and onto her pillow anyway. She wiped away the wetness with the back of her hand and felt a little bit ashamed for crying. No matter how hard she tried to hold them back, she just couldn't. She hated where she was. She hated who she was, and there was nothing she could do to change it. She turned on her side and watched the beams of car headlights outside flicker across the walls through the high, narrow windows of the 4th Street shelter. Her father lay sleeping in the bed next to him. Livy pulled her covers up to her chin and lay awake, remembering the promise her father had made. He had promised that Livy and her little brother would have a home again, a place of their own, where they'd be safe and happy. Livy would have her own bed and her own room again, where she could dream her own special dreams the way other kids did. Poppy had promised them that, and Livy had believed him. But drifting off to sleep, Livy felt more doubtful than hopeful. Grown-ups sometimes made promises they couldn't keep, though they meant to. Over a year earlier in early November, the factory where Poppy worked had closed down. At first, having Poppy at home all day was fun. He took Livy and Younger out for cheeseburgers and ice cream, and they went to the zoo and the history museum together. The three spent more time together in those 6 months than they had ever before. And Younger even put his old blanket away in the back of his closet. But when Poppy's unemployment ran out, it wasn't as much fun to have him around the trailer all the time. He began to spend more and more time sitting outside in a creaky lawn chair, staring at the squirrels and birds nesting in the trees that lined the dirt road running through the Oak Haven Mobile Home Park, where they lived. Sometimes when she walked home from the school bus stop, Livy saw Poppy sitting in the chair, bent over with his face in his hands and shaking his head, or even talking to himself. She knew that something bad was going to happen. Then something happened when the manager of the Oak Haven Mobile Home Park knocked softly at their door one day and told Poppy that they would have to pick up their things and leave. The rent was 6 months late. And unpaid rent was unpaid taxes, the manager said. Sorry, he murmured and walked back to the office with a shrug of his bony shoulders. Livy and Younger helped Poppy pack whatever they could squeeze into 2 suitcases and some trash bags with handle ties. The 3 of them stood together outside the trailer and watched the manager put a long chain and thick padlock on the door. Then they took the bus into town. The 4th Street shelter for the homeless was the only place Poppy could think of to go where Livy and Younger would be safe and have a bed to sleep in. My children aren't going to live on the streets, Poppy whispered as they walked from the bus to the door of the shelter together. The people who ran the shelter understood and took them in. They helped Poppy get the family settled, but Livy and Younger had to share a bed because there was just one left. A lady took Livy by the hand and introduced her to other kids about her age who lived at the shelter too. On the first night, Livy was frightened. She had never had to share a place to live with so many people, and there were 50 or more people in the shelter that night. Poppy stayed close to Livy and Younger, and they fell asleep while he sang "Hush-a-bye, baby, don't you cry," a song their mother used to sing to them. That was the night when Poppy promised Livy that they would have a home by the time the leaves in October were red and gold. Living in the shelter wasn't so bad in the beginning. There were other families there too. Some had just moms or just dads, but most had children near Livy's age. Although she was shy at first, she soon made friends. Some of the other kids had lived at the shelter for a long time and seemed very grown up. They showed Livy where to do the family laundry and where to get sheets and covers to make the bed. Livy listened carefully, but she was too embarrassed to tell them that she'd never washed clothes in a washing machine before. Livy's best friend at the shelter was a girl named Belinda Johansen, whose family had been living there for more than a year. Mr. Johansen had worked in a factory like Poppy. Then the owners had closed it to build a new one in another town. Belinda's father went out to look for work nearly every day, but there weren't many jobs that paid enough to get a place for all the Johansens to live. Belinda's mom was nice. She had gray blue eyes like Livy's mother. The Johansens had 5 kids. Baby Emmett was still on a bottle. Sometimes Belinda and Livy tried to teach Emmett shapes, letters, and colors with things they had found in the storerooms or kitchen, but Emmett wasn't ready to learn, and he tossed the red apple for A and blue bowl for B and coffee cup for C. And on the floor, up in the air. Livy and Belinda laughed and tried again, but Emmett was stubborn. The day Livy and Belinda met, Belinda had asked where Livy's mother was. "She's not here," Livy had told her. "I know that," Belinda said. "Where is she?" Livy shrugged. "She's gone." "But where did she go?" Belinda asked. "She's just gone," Livy shouted, and she walked away. She didn't want to talk about her mother, not with Belinda Johansen or anybody else. Belinda was careful not to ask about Livy's mother again. Livy and Younger quickly learned all the stay-inside games that the kids in the shelter played, like Chinese checkers and jacks and Old Maid. There were lots of toys and games, though most of them were hand-me-downs and some were missing parts or pieces. Since the shelter was on a busy street, most of the kids weren't allowed to play outside, but none of them wanted to anyway. Maybe something about being homeless made kids kind of forget about the outside world. Some of the little ones had been inside for so long everything outside frightened them. Even after she'd been in the shelter for weeks, though, Livy still missed playing in the park near their trailer, and she thought of how she and Mama had taken long walks together, picking dandelions to put in the kitchen and talking to each other. They had talked about school, about the things that were special between mothers and daughters. Mama had asked about boys and what Livy wanted to be. But that was before they had moved into the shelter, before Mama had gone. Livy didn't like to think about those days, and she struggled to push them out of her mind. Every Sunday, Mr. Johansen and Poppy sat down and read through the job ads in the newspaper together. They smiled, nodded, or frowned at each other as they crossed off ads with their pencils, or circled them for checking out. Most jobs were for engineers and doctors or for lawyers and accountants. Some of the older, lonely people who stayed in the shelter had scared Livy and Younger at first. A few of them were sick and coughed terribly, and some smelled bad from wearing the same worn-out ragged clothes every day. Livy felt sorry for them because she knew they were all alone in the world, but what scared her was wondering if Poppy would become like them. He already had a tired, sad look in his eyes, and sometimes he forgot to shave or tuck in his shirt tail. Younger didn't get used to shelter living as easily as Livy or Poppy. He was only 5 when they arrived, and strangers still frightened him. During the first few weeks, Poppy stayed up almost every night, holding Younger and rocking him to sleep. When Livy woke up in the morning, Poppy often would be asleep in a chair next to their bed with his hand clutching a part of Younger's tattered blanket. Though most of the shelter people were nice to him. Younger cried whenever anyone he didn't know came near, no matter what Poppy said to him or how long he cuddled him. Younger still cried. Sometimes he wet the bed, and after Poppy changed the sheets and covers, he held Younger even tighter in his arms. Finally, Younger settled down, and he even slept through the night, though he still held on to his old blanket. He made a special friend, too, an old lady whose name was Madeira. Madeira told him stories about when she had been a school teacher and let Younger play with whatever he pulled out of the 2 giant brown bags she dragged along everywhere she went. Madeira was one of the oldest one of the oddest people in the shelter, and even though she was nice to Livy, there was something a little scary about her. But Younger didn't seem to mind, and Livy knew that Madeira's company was a lot more important than her being strange. Most of the people living in the shelter were very different from the ones Livy had known at the Oak Haven, but all of them had one thing in common. They didn't have homes of their own, and that was something people outside didn't seem to understand at all. The weeks and months passed quickly, and early summer came. October was only 5 months away, but Poppy still hadn't found work. He looked through the paper every Sunday, and he went out to interviews almost every day. None of the jobs paid enough to stretch for all three of them, so Poppy kept looking for something better. Livy noticed that Poppy was getting thinner and thinner, and that his trousers seemed to hang looser around his hips. Do you think he'll get like old Pike? She asked Belinda Johansen one day. Old Pike was one of the shelter people who had grown so thin that his skin looked as if it were stretched across his bones. He mostly sat in a corner watching TV. My pa's skinny, and he's not like old Pike, Belinda told Livy, but her eyes looked doubtful. Some afternoons the two girls sat together on the front steps of the shelter and watched passers-by for a while, trying to imagine what kind of house each one was going home to. That one lives in a mansion with 3 bathrooms, I bet, Belinda whispered to Livy, and she pointed to a lady getting into a taxi. I think that man has a big apartment with a fancy whirlpool bathtub in it, Livy whispered, as she motioned toward a man wearing a stylish suit. Livy and Belinda sat quietly for a few minutes, watching the people who walked by and wishing they had homes to go back to. I wish I could think of a way to get out of here, Livy said quietly. I miss going to school. Me too, Belinda sighed. But we're just kids. Livy didn't think that being a kid mattered very much because living in the shelter made kids grow up faster. Shelter kids had to do grown-up things like laundry and babysitting, and they learned to be careful with money. There has to be something I can do to help Poppy get us out of here, Livy said quietly. I hate it here. I want my old room back. But Belinda Johansen shook her head. There weren't many things Livy could think of to do in the shelter that she could get paid for. She and Belinda sometimes watched other people's kids when they went to job interviews or to doctor appointments or to the county aid office, but nobody had money to pay them. A thank you was usually all they got. Livy tried to think of something to do or something to make and sell outside the shelter where people had money. She thought about making potholders from rag strips like the ones she'd seen selling at church bazaars, or making plant trays from throwaway plastic soup bowls. But she didn't know how to weave the rag strips to make potholders, and it didn't seem fair to use up all the finger paint in the recreation room to decorate plant trays. Belinda told Livy to start a wake-up service for people in the shelter, but nearly everyone living there got up at sunrise anyway. It was hard to oversleep with 40 other people moving around, washing and making noise early in the morning. Some of the people didn't sleep at all, but only sat on their beds, rocking back and forth all night. Some watched TV, or played cards, or talked to each other till sunup. There had to be something else Livy could do. Okay, guys, that's the end of chapter 1.